Okay, so you got the screen up there. You can see it right there. Unclean the other not meat. That's, again, my poor attempt at humor. You know, for a while there was a lot of ads that was trying to promote pork as some kind of healthy alternative because red meat, bad, white meat, good. Well, if we identify pork with white meat, then that's obviously good, even though most health professionals will still tell you it's one of the unhealthiest meats that you can eat. So they would say, you know, pork, the other white meat. Like that's by just that statement somehow made it good, you know. So as I said, we're going to be talking about holiness. You say, well, what is this? What? I thought you said we're going to be talking about holiness. Well, by the time I get to the end, the connection will be clear. Okay, so Genesis 9:3 says this: everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. All right, so we're going to deal with some verses of contention that people have contention on this topic of unclean and clean and unclean, and whether it's even relevant for a believer today. And so Genesis 9:3 says, everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave the green plants, I now give you everything. Mark 7:19 from New International Version says, for it doesn't go into their hearts, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. And in saying this, Jesus declared, all food's clean. All right? Okay. And then Acts 10:11 through 15 says, he saw heaven open and something like a large sheet being let down to the earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals as well as reptiles and birds. And then a voice told him, get up, Peter, kill and eat. Surely not, Lord, Peter replied. I've never eaten anything impure or unclean. And the voice spoke to him a second time and says, do not call anything impure that God has made clean. That's it. Eat whatever you like. That's the sum of it, right? I mean, that's really the base argument is Christianity. It's you got Mark, it says Jesus pronounced all foods unclean. You got Acts chapter 2. That's it. It's really the beginning and end of the story, right? So not so fast. Let's slow down, right? There's a lot of issue in here, and there's a lot on this topic, and even with what I'm going to deal with today, this could be way, way longer dealing with everything I'm not. Maybe another time I'll do some addendums to this. There are those in Christianity to tell you today that if you do not, as a Christian, eat unclean foods, if you're abstaining from unclean foods as a Christian, that you are doing something wicked even. There is a man named Andrew Womack. He has a teaching out where he quotes from, I believe it's Titus, and he basically says, if anyone tells you not to eat pork on account of God, that is a doctrine of demons, because he's misquoting and misapplying Paul's writings there. So by implication, it's saying way back in Leviticus that it wasn't God that spoke from the mountain. That was a demon that spoke. I mean, that's the only way to interpret what he's saying there. That wasn't really God in your Bible. That was really a demon that said that, because that's a doctrine of demons. You know, he would say, no, that was God then, but because of Jesus, that all changed, right? Because we have on Mark that he pronounced all foods clean, and so there, and so on and so forth, right? So we have these verses of contention, and we're going to approach them from a slightly different angle. Genesis 9:3 says, everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. So the question begs, why that statement? Would it not have been sufficient for God to just say, everything that lives and moves will be food for you? End. So why does he go and say, just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything? So with that statement, does everything mean everything? Because He's saying I'm giving you everything, but is he really saying I'm giving you everything? Follow me. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. So we need to look at how he gave the green plants, right? Genesis 1:29 says, Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be as food for you. So when God gave these things as food, he didn't just give a blanket statement. He gave it with stipulation. So he gave them all seed-bearing plants, but then he said only some of it as food for you. Now, I've been challenged on using this before, okay, because it's basically like, well, doesn't everything have seeds? Not necessarily. And Google says, not every plant grows from a seed. Some plants like ferns and mosses grow from spores. Other plants use asexual vegetative reproduction and grow new plants from rhizomes or tubers. We can also use techniques like grafting or taking cuttings to make new plants. Okay. So theoretically speaking, and beyond that, we could also say there are many things even within that. Just because the Bible doesn't break everything down, okay, there are many things that we can eat that will kill you. Do you really think God meant them for food for you? I mean, there are some berries that will kill you or make you very sick. So they may have seeds. Doesn't necessarily mean the statement is not necessarily meant literal. We're to understand that there are probably extra details that go along with this, right? So if the statement is just, why does the Bible say, just as I gave these green plants, I now give you everything? Could that statement be an implication that just because I'm giving you everything, not all of it will really be food per se? There may be stipulations of things that are food and that they are not food. We have the account of Noah. Why was there a distinction between clean and unclean in Noah's day? Noah had 7 of every clean animal, 2 of every unclean animal, right? If he would have ate the unclean animal, we wouldn't have them today because there was only 2, and once you ate one, they could not reproduce anymore. So why 7? Well, 7 so for food and for sacrifice, right? I've heard some say in Judaism too that when God later tells Noah that you can eat animals, that it's okay to eat animals, that it was about a fundamental change in the earth that occurred then. That may be true. The baseline is the whole earth was flooded. There probably wasn't much greenery for Noah and his family to eat anyway. Meat was pretty much going to be their only primary option available to them. Okay. So what did? Correct. Right. Yeah, in the garden they didn't have every tree. They had almost every tree, but there was still one. There was always stipulation within what God says. Everything is yours, but there are some exceptions, right? And so, what does the word say? Leviticus 11:1 through 3 says, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, say to the Israelites that of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a divided hoof and that chews the cud. So God is giving specific instructions. Now, before continuing, I do think it's also worth noting here, because I have to say this a lot. A lot of times there's this notion that at Mount Sinai there are things that weren't true that suddenly became true. With the giving of the Torah, some things changed, and that's kind of true, but not really. Okay, why? Because the Torah is from the Creator. Comes from the mind of the Creator, and therefore was not bound within the confines of time and space. being not bound in the confines of times and space means it was always true. The issue is there are points in time where humanity knew it and didn't know it. Okay? So our awareness doesn't mean that it wasn't true before we became aware of it. Okay? Just like the expression, if you touch a hot stove, you're going to get burned. Did that stove never burn before you touched it? The moment you touched it, that changed something fundamentally with stoves, and now that you were burned by that stove, all stoves burn from now on? No, the stove burned before you touched it. You just became aware of that at that point in time. So it is with the Torah. The Torah was always true from the beginning. There are just different parts of it that were maybe more applicable or could be applied based on certain conditions being fulfilled that enabled it to be applied. And those are the issues that we deal with. And then the issue of awareness. We become aware of it. So everything Yahweh is saying here to Moses and Aaron, it's very well possible, and one can make the case that Yahweh had revealed the same things to Noah. Noah walked with God, and he found grace in his sight. What does it mean that Noah walked with God? It means Noah was a prophet. God spoke to Noah, told him to build an ark. Do you think God spoke to Noah one time, said, build an ark, never talked to him again? Never said another word to Noah. No, Scripture just doesn't record it all. It's not all relevant. How bogged down would Genesis be in the Noah narrative when it's trying to get to a certain point, which is God's revelation to a people, to suddenly stop there and then list everything God spoke to Noah right there, and then moved on and continued? And what if it did that every time? The book would be vast. It'd be so huge. Right? So no, it's a compression. It's zimzum. It's a compression of the mind of God. So, and of all the creatures living in water, and of the seas and the streams you may eat any that have fins and scales. But all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to regard as unclean. Okay? By this definition, we mean not food. This stuff is food, that stuff is not food. So when we come to Mark 7:18 through 20, okay, we know what God says. That was God's statement there. And we have Yeshua here speaking. He says, are you so dull, he asked? Don't you see that nothing enters a person from outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their hearts, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. And see, this is where people go, oh, see, Jesus declared all foods clean. And so it's not what goes into a person that defiles them. Well, there's a lot of really surface misunderstandings in this whole topic to begin with, and where we even get there, and we're going to go through some of that. But the question is, are people so dull as to not notice the parentheses in their Bible? It's a parenthetical statement. So the parenthetical statement goes, should that even be in there to begin with? And again, it's not like this is a declaration. It's saying, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Now we know from Greek manuscripts and even the Aramaic New Testament, the Peshitta in its original form, that's the Aramaic version of the New Testament, lacks this in its original form. Some versions have had it redacted in there from the Greek, but in its original form it lacks this. We know many Greek manuscripts lack this, and that it by and large, most Greek scholars will even say that this statement was an amendment by a translator to help clarify a point. But even if we leave it, we can say this is a true statement. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. We can leave it in there. We can even treat it as a statement. I'm going to explain how that works in a second. But by and large, it doesn't really belong. It just should really say it doesn't go into their heart, but in their stomach and then out of the body. Okay. There's a lot of amazing things being said here, and it gives us what we call the halakha, or the legal aspects from our Master Yeshua on this topic of what happens when somebody eats something, even something defiled, okay? Because if you notice in the Torah narrative in Leviticus 11, it doesn't say what happens to you if you eat something unclean. It just says it's not food. Now it tells you if you touch a carcass, right, that it says you become ritually impure. It tells you certain conditions you become ritually impure. It never states what happens to you if you accidentally eat shellfish. Or if you intentionally eat shellfish. It never studies what's happened to you. What happens to you? Well, this spawned quite a bit of debate with the rabbis, etc. What could happen? Does it defile you? Does it render you permanently impure? What happens? What happens to a person? What does eating something unclean do for you? Okay. So we may come back to that. So we need to notice what is lacking. And he saith unto them, Are you so without understanding also? Do you not perceive, and this is from Mark 7:18 through 20, do you not perceive that whatsoever things from without entereth into a man, it cannot defile him, because it entereth not to his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the drought, purging all meats, and that should be rendered rather food. Right, and he said, that which cometh out of the man, that it's that which comes out of a man that defileth the man. Okay, this is really important because I'm going to go on to the next slide and I'm going to say something that may be surprising to some, because if you have a Christian background and you come to this verse and you approach it and you go, well, it certainly seems like something's changing here, saying some kind of changes here, right? Because you know that these things were unclean, and if you ate them, well, this, as I just stated, the Torah doesn't say what happens to you if you eat something unclean. One. That's an important statement. Two, Yeshua's statement is 100% true according to the Torah, with a touch of hyperbole. In other words, Yeshua didn't have to change anything. What he said was true then, was true before he came, was true after he came. Okay? The scripture doesn't say if you eat something unclean, it renders you ritually impure. So his statement was true. What goes into your mouth doesn't defile you. And upon whatsoever any of them which they are dead does it fall, it shall be unclean. This is Leviticus, or Vayikra 11:32-34. And upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, does it fall, it shall be unclean, whether it be any vessel of wood or raiment or skin or sack or whatsoever vessel it be, where any work is done, it must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until the evening, so it shall be cleansed. And every earthen vessel whereto any of them falls whatsoever, and it shall be unclean, and you shall break it. And all the meat which may be eaten, on which such water comes, shall be unclean, and all drink that may be drunk in every such vessel shall be unclean. Now, I say there's a touch of hyperbole in Yeshua's statement because there is one corner case, okay? There is one corner case where clean food can become defiled, and that's if a carcass falls in a worked vessel and renders that water in there impure, and that water gets on the clean food. It's the only case. How often do you think this is really going to happen? This is like a corner case. It's like a 1 in a million, 1 in a billion shot that this is not something you're facing on a daily basis. So when Yeshua says there's nothing that you put in you that is going to defile you, the statement's 100% true according to Torah, other than this one corner case. Okay, so Yeshua's statement, if you take it super literally, then okay, Yeshua obviously was wrong, or he changed something because now water, but that's it. You understand what I'm saying? Does it make sense? That was the only case where clean food becomes defiled, is this one segment of Leviticus, this one in a million shot. Not going to happen every day. The Torah does not state what happens when you eat unclean food. It only states to not do it, and it connects it with or to holiness. What? We'll go back to that. So let's go back to Mark. There's more here. Mark 7:1, and I intentionally use the King James Version here because this is one of the most prominent and often used when dealing with this topic. Mark 7:1-2 says, Then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, with unwashen hands, they found fault. So this is what precedes the text where we find out Yeshua declares all food clean. So it's important to know what comes before. So what comes before is this. We have some Pharisees and some scribes. And where they come from? Jerusalem. Why is that relevant? Who cares? Maybe the scripture's just giving you an extra detail just to give it to you. Or maybe it's giving you a detail to tell you something. I want to tell you it's giving you a detail to tell you something, and I'm going to explain why. Not all Pharisees were in agreement with all things. Did you know that? There were multiple schools. There was school of Shammai, a school of Hillel, and there were other smaller schools besides that. And after Hillel's death, which was around this time period, Shammai took over. And the school of Shammai was the dominant leading school of Jewish thought. But there were many offshoots, especially many of Hillel's disciples broke off and started their own schools, including his grandson Gamaliel, who was the person who taught the Apostle Paul or Rab Shaul or Saul, however you want to say him, and refer to him, or say his name and refer to him, okay? So it's really important to note that these came from Jerusalem, and I'm going to explain why. Did you know that not all the Jews, when Ezra and Nehemiah came up to rebuild the wall and to restore help the restoration process for the second temple, did you know not all the Jews left Babylon then? Did you know in Yeshua's day, Babylon had the second largest Jewish population in the world next to Jerusalem? There was approximately, I think I read somewhere, I might have these numbers wrong, I should have pulled them, but probably, I think it was 300,000 plus, maybe it was 600,000 Jewish individuals living in Babylon. The world population at this point in time was not super huge. It wasn't 6 billion like today. It was a pretty massive population in Babylon. Okay. Why is this relevant? I'm getting there. How many of you have heard of an organization such as Chabad? Yeah, most of you have heard of Chabad. Chabad is a Jewish organization mainly targeting at missioning Jews to encourage them to perform more mitzvot, more commandments. Okay, but they don't just want you to perform more. I mean, they do. It's simply stating they do just want to see more commandments performed, but specifically they represent a certain branch of orthodoxy, and ideally you perform them that way. Now, Chabad's pretty open to various forms of Judaism. They're not like you have to do it this way. By and large, they promote a certain orthodox viewpoint in how these things should be done, okay? And so the real target is missionizing Jews to get them to perform more commandments. So there was a large group of Pharisees who came out of Babylon to Jerusalem. And why Jerusalem? Because that is the place of judgment. That's where all judgment had to come. If you wanted, let's look at it this way. If you wanted to really influence politics in the United States, where are you going to go? Washington, D.C., right? Why? Because that's where the laws are set. So if you wanted to influence politics within Judaism during the first century, where are you going to go? You're going to go to Jerusalem. So they went up to Jerusalem, and they brought many of their innovations with them because they represented a specific brand of Judaism. And then from Jerusalem, they would missionize the rest of Israel, or the rest of Judah, really, the standing kingdom. That's what you have here. You have a specific branch of Pharisees trying to missionize other Jews with their form of Judaism. Okay? Now, it's important to note that there were many Jews in the area of Galilee that were never even taken during the Babylonian exile. So any reformations or any changes that happened in Babylon, they would not have been as influenced by them. Hence, Peter, James, John, these Galileans, they represented a different branch of Judaism. Still Orthodox, just different, okay? So when the scribes and Pharisees that came from Jerusalem and they saw some of his disciples who were Galileans, these were from Jerusalem, eat bread with defiled, that is to say unwashed hands, they found fault. In other words, you're not practicing the halacha the way we do. Why? This is the way we do it. This is the way things are done. Why aren't you doing it this way? Mark 7:3-5 says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews," now that's not literally all the Jews, because listen, this is a hyperbole statement of which the New Testament is full of, because if this was all the Jews, is Yeshua not a Jew? Is Peter not a Jew? Is James not a Jew? Is John not a Jew? Is Andrew not a Jew? No, they're all Jews, okay? But doesn't this say all the Jews? Yes, it does. It means as a whole, it's a hyperbole statement. It's a statement of exaggeration for a point. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands, oft eat not, holding the traditions of the elders. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not, and many other things there be which they have received to hold, as the washings of cups and pots and brassen vessels and of tables. And then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why walk not thou disciples according to the traditions of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? So there's a controversy going on here between Yeshua, his disciples, and these Pharisees from Jerusalem. And it's not about eating a ham sandwich. It's not what it's about. It's about hand washing. That's what it's about. It's about hand washing. How do we know? Because the scripture just told us. That's what it's about. And the greater issue is not just about hand washing, it's why aren't you walking after the tradition of the elders? Right? Now, again, these are innovations that came from certain groups from Babylon. Now, obviously, not all of Judaism really did this, because we have examples of people that were not doing this, okay? And so, in particular, verse 5 says, Why walk not thy disciples? That's important. Why walk? Okay? Why is that relevant? Because if I were to say that in Hebrew, walk is halach, where we get halacha, which we call Jewish law, which actually is not, that word doesn't really mean law, it means walking, how you walk. So when the New Testament talks all over about walking, it's talking about halak, it's talking about how you judge, how you interpret law. Halakha at its core is not even just about law, though that's an aspect. Halakha at its core is how do you live your life with God daily? That is the essence of halakha, how you walk. How do you walk, right? Scripture says when you lie down, when you rise up, when you walk along the road, right? You're supposed to speak of these things. When you walk, when you halach, when you walk along the road, the derek, the path. When you walk the path, right? How do you live? How do you live? How do you walk with God daily? That's what this is about. So how are they? This is a legal matter in essence. It's also a practical matter. How do you live? Why aren't you following after this pattern? Okay? That's the issue. And more importantly, there's some key words here. Verse 5 says, but eat bread with unwashed hands. Okay? That's the contention, specifically bread. Why are they eating bread with unwashed hands? It doesn't say, why are you eating that piece of chicken with unwashed hands? That's not the issue. Bread. Okay? Hand washing. In temple times, there were elaborate rules in connection with ritual impurity. If a person had been rendered impure through having come into contact with, say, a dead rodent, he contaminated sacred food such as the tithe given to the priest, which must then not be eaten. The way in which contamination of this kind could be removed was through immersion in a ritual bath. But the sages imposed in certain circumstances the minor form of contamination known as hand contamination, in which only the hands, not the whole body, was contaminated, and for this to be removed, total immersion was not required, only the ritual washing of the hands. Since there was a good deal of priest tithe in ancient Palestine which could easily come into contact with the hands, the sages eventually ordained that the hands of every Jew, not only the hands of a priest, must be washed ritually before meals. Okay, who imposed this? The sages. Who did they impose it upon? Every Jew. Does that not sound like what we just read in Mark? And every Jew wash their hands, right? Especially if they go into the markets. The markets, that's where meat comes from. That's where a tithe for priests could come from. Where slaughtering was done, where meat was sold. Now, not just meat necessarily. It could be food. And in this case, you have Roman occupation, which was exceptionally dangerous because you had meat, because they erected their pagan temples. And so in your very market, you'd have meat sacrificed on the altars for pagan gods now being sold amongst your kosher deli there, And so the thought process was contamination from this would render clean food ritually impure. Although the original reason for washing the hands no longer applies since there is no sacred food to be eaten, the ritual was continued on the grounds that the ideal of holiness demands special ritualistic washing of the hands. The act of washing the hands in this sense is seen as the introduction of the holiness ideal into the mundane life of the Jew. This ritual washing is only required before a meal at which bread is eaten. Isn't that interesting? What was the contention? Why do you eat bread with unwashed hands? In Judaism, the ritual washing of a hand is only required before a meal at which bread is eaten. One of the amazing things of why this is relevant, like so many things in the New Testament, is that there are those, especially in Judaism today, that say, much of the way Judaism today is practiced is a much later innovation than the temple times, and during the temple times, Judaism was vastly different. I argue that there are some differences between modern Judaism and Judaism that was practiced during the time of the Second Temple. By and large, the New Testament proves over and over and over again that much of Jewish practice you see today was very alive and well during this time of the Second Temple, including ritual washing of the hands, including the binding of tefillin, or phylacteries, and composed prayer, and many other things, meeting in synagogues, the reading of the Torah, okay? It's all there. You can find it all throughout the New Testament. It's not that vastly different. Okay? Now, real quick, one of the things that can be supposed, though it's not stated implicitly anywhere that I've seen, is why they were so worried about bread. Understand that bread is a product of water and flour. Being a product of water and flour, remember the one corner case in the Torah deals with water being contaminated and thus potentially rendering food unclean. That may be the original source of it, is thinking since bread is a water flour product, there's actually water in the bread, even though not really, that maybe that could somehow contaminate it and contaminate other food. Maybe not. Just a supposition. Otherwise, who knows what the real original reason why bread specifically was chosen. So here's some more on this topic. This particular form of evolution or immersion is the one which has survived most completely and most practiced by Jews. Before any meal which bread forms a part, the hands must be solemnly washed and the appropriate benediction recited. Before prayer, too, the hands must be washed. Also after any unclean bodily function or after contact with an unclean object. This comes from Chabad. Do this only before eating a meal with bread or matzah. The halacha also requiring washing before cake if it's eaten as a full meal. Bread is considered the staple food of all foods. Potatoes just miss the boat. This may sound strange, but before washing your hands, be sure that they are clean or free of anything that will anything that will obstruct the waters from reaching the entire surface of your hands. This is a spiritual experience, you recall, beyond pasture. In other words, yeah, it's great that there is, yeah, yeah, that rings too. Yeah, and it's really interesting that, again, there may be side benefits for having clean hands. Typically speaking, like most other immersions, you're clean before you do it. So it's really not about washing dirt from your hands. It's about a spiritual experience, and hopefully that makes you recall words like Peter, and it's not about the washing of filth from the body, but of a clean conscience towards God. That's what all this is about from their perspective anyway. So again, and then also remove your rings, unless you never remove them, in which case they're considered part of your hand. Now we could debate again, this is how halacha works, we could debate like, what do we mean by never? Do we mean never ever? Or do we mean if it's just on rare occasions and so on and so forth? How frequently does removing your ring constitute never removing your ring, right? But we won't get into that. Just suffice it to say, if you don't remove your ring much, you don't have to remove it. It's considered part of your hand. Then you fill a cup with water and pour twice on your right hand and repeat on the left. Lefties reverse the order. Chabad custom is to pour 3 times on each hand. Make sure that water covers your entire hand until the wrist bone with each pour. Separate your fingers slightly to allow the water in between them. Rabbi Hizda says, don't skimp. Fill your hands with water and God will fill them with His goodness. After washing, lift your hands chest height and say the following blessing. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with His commandments and commanded us concerning the washing of the hands. And there's the full blessing there. And say this blessing only if you intend to eat more than 2 ounces of bread. If it's less than 2 ounces, blessing's not necessary. This is just halacha. This is just how it works. Right or wrong, funny or what? This is what it is. Okay, so what, by and large, some form of this is the issue that the Pharisees and scribes were having with Yeshua's disciples. This, what I've just read and just taught you. They're eating bread. They didn't wash their hands. And they could potentially defile themselves by this process through their food. Because if their hands are contaminated, that bread's going to become contaminated and they're going to eat the contaminated bread. You following me? So the rest of the ceremony goes like this. You rub your hands together and then dry them. Be careful not to speak or get involved in anything else until you've recited the blessing on your bread and swallowed some too. If you take a washroom break during your meal or otherwise soil your hands, you need to wash again, this time without a blessing. So principle and practice. The procedure is to pour water out from a cup or glass first twice over the right hand, or in Chabad custom 3 times, and then twice over the left hand. And in particular, the custom is to cup your hand kind of to make a fist. I'm going to say why that's relevant here, because there's going to be no question that this is the custom in contention here in just a second. There's an interlinear view, and up there I have underlined that this is from Mark. Okay, many translations don't translate this part. Many just say unless their hands are washed, but specifically in Mark it says with a fist. Unless they wash their hands with a fist. This is the exact ceremony that's practiced today that's being discussed and being at odds. If any man have ears to hear, Mark 7:14 through 16 says, and when he called all the people unto him, he said unto them, hearken unto me, every one of you, and understand. There is nothing from without a man that entereth into him can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are they that defile a man. If any man have ears to hear, let him hear. So Yeshua's statement is 100% true according to the Torah without change or omission. Already. It's already a true Torah statement. The reason why scribes and Pharisees were having an issue with it, because they were having a practice that was loosely based on Torah concepts, but was entirely their own innovation, and they were teaching it as a commandment of God. You with me? That's the issue. If they just practice that, and they say this is how we do things and this is how we should do things, that's fine. But by saying that, by calling it a tradition of the elders, they're by way of invoking God giving the right to elders to make decrees for the community. They're using that as an invocation to say that this is indirectly authorized by God. That's what they're saying. They're basically saying we have this authority directly set up by God to impose this on you, and you're not doing that. So you're sinning. You're not sinning, but you're sinning. Okay. You're not sinning according to God's commandment. You're sinning according to our commandment. That's what it boils down to. Ears to hear and eyes to see relate a parable or sod a deeper meaning to the Torah text. Okay. He says you have ears to hear, eyes to see. In other words, listen. Are you listening? Are you paying attention? Are you following me? Are you tracking what I'm saying? Mark 7:17 says, and when he entered into the house from the people, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So in other words, when he said back here, he was relating a parable. Okay, he's not necessarily teaching direct scripture. This is a parable. He said, there's nothing from without a man that entereth into him can defile him, but the things that come without, those that are defile him, the man. And if any man has ears to hear, let him hear. And when he entered into the house from his people, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. What parable? This. Right? 15 and 16. Okay. Where do hearing ears and seeing eyes come from? Deuteronomy 29:2-4 says this, and Moses called unto all Israel and said unto them, you have seen all that Yahweh did before your eyes in the land of Egypt unto Pharaoh and all the hearts of his servants and all this land, the great trials which your eyes have seen, the signs and those great miracles. Yet Yahweh did not give you a heart to perceive and eyes to see and ears to hear unto this day. So we know Yahweh needs to give us eyes to see and ears to hear. So when Yeshua says, does anyone have, he's asking essentially, is there anyone who God has given the ability to perceive and understand? Okay. Because without eyes to see and without ears to hear, your heart's going to be dull. It's going to be dead. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he says at that point. It's not going to mean anything to you. So what comes from without? An unusual discharge from a man, potentially an STD or other issue. That's Leviticus 15. That's something that comes from without. And if it gets on you, it defiles you. It doesn't go the other way. It goes out. Seed of copulation. That comes out and renders defilement. A woman's flow of menstruation, that comes out and renders defilement. It doesn't go in and render defilement, it comes out. There are things that come from you, outside of you, and they render defilement. This is Yeshua's parable. When Yeshua says, it's not what goes in you. If you read Leviticus, when it talks about food, it never says what happens when you eat it. It does say what a menstrual discharge does. It does say what a seminal discharge does. It does say what unusual discharge, and it does say these things follow you. Why does the Torah say this? This is the question at hand. Why? Why do these things that come from within you, out of you, defile you? Is there a deeper lesson here? Yes, the deeper lesson is this, and this is what Yeshua is explaining. Yeshua is merely revealing the deeper meaning to the question of why do these things that come from without create defilement? And the meaning is Mark 7:19 to 23. This is what the Torah is trying to teach us by these things. Because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth into the drought, purging all meats. And he said, that which comes out of a man that defile the man, from within, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, and evil eye, blasphemy, pride, or licentiousness, and evil eye, blasphemy, pride, and foolishness. And all these things come from within, and defile the man. So the deeper meaning of why these things create, why they create ritual impurity is because they come from within us, and it's that's within us is what really defiles us. That's what the lesson. This is what Yeshua is saying. The real lesson the Torah is trying to teach us with these things is that the things within us that come without is the source of what really defiles us. So we have Acts, Peter, and a sheet, right? Where does this fit into anything? I mean, doesn't that really clear things up? So we have Acts 10:10 through 12. And he became very hungry and would have eaten, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance. So this is Peter. Okay, he was very hungry. Very, very hungry. He was going to eat, but while he was waiting for the food to be prepared, he fell into a trance. And saw heaven open, and a certain vessel descending upon him, as it had been a great sheet knit at four corners and let down to the earth, and wherein all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowl of the air. Acts 10:13 through 14 says, And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. The scripture says that God isn't tempted, neither does he tempt. Right? There's clean and unclean food on this sheet. Peter is very, very hungry. Very, very, very hungry. At a very weak state. So the question is God tempting Peter? Then, I mean, if I'm super hungry and there's food here available for me to eat, should I make distinction? I mean, shouldn't I just, cave into that? Or is God testing Peter, right? Is he testing Peter? The issue is God doesn't tempt, but he does test. And there is a test here. And the test isn't really, did you learn back in Mark 7 that I made all foods clean, Peter? Didn't you learn that lesson? Now I'm tempting you to see if you learned it, or now I'm testing you. No, in fact, what's really, really important is the two words Peter says here. I've never eaten anything that is common or unclean. Okay? There's two words there, and they mean very specific things in Judaism. And it's one of the reasons why Leviticus, or Vayikra, is the first book taught in Jewish studies on the scriptures. You'd think, why don't they start with Genesis? That's in the beginning. Well, because this is where it's practical to Jewish life. You start here with the things practical to Jewish life in Vayikra. And so they learn what common and unclean mean. Okay, and there is a fundamental distinction. When we talk about common, we're talking about things that are potentially ritually impure. So that the first word is koinos, common. Ritually impure from tuma. Tuma is contamination. It's the Hebrew word for contamination. So koinos means common, shared, unclean, but it's not unclean the same way as a pig is unclean, okay? It means common, ritually impure from tuma, from contamination. In other words, as a human being, if you come across a dead body, you acquire a state of tuma. And there are ways to fix that, okay? When you encounter a dead body, you do not become unclean the way a pig is unclean. It's not the same. Most Christians don't understand that. They don't understand there's different states here. In other words, if you become unclean from coming in contact with, say, um, a certain state that renders you ritually impure, generally speaking, you can immerse in water, and at the evening, you'll be rendered ritually pure. You can take a pig and you can dunk it in water 1,000 times, and when it comes out of that water at the end of the day, at evening, guess what? It's still unclean. Why? Because it is lo tohar. It is not pure. It is unclean. It's a part of its characteristics. It was part of its creation. It's unclean. Look, shellfish, right? Or shrimp lives in the water. It lives in the water. It should be clean as clean can be, right? It lives in the water. But it's not. It's unclean. It's unclean to you, regardless of the reason. Now, one of the things before I continue, I do want to stress here is there's a lot of ways people approach this and trying to teach this and trying to sell this to people, including going about the health benefits, and I think that's fine and dandy. You're not going to hear that from me. I may talk to you about the health benefits and things like that as a side conversation. The reality is God created us. That's my belief. God created us, and he created all things in the heavens and the earth, everything upon it, and he knows what its purpose is, and he knows what it's used to be. And so I want a person to abstain from unclean things because God said so, not because the cardiologist said so. I mean, that may be good. The cardiologist may say that, and you may need to do that just for basic health purposes. That's great. But it's different. It's different. One is a commandment of man. The other is a commandment of God. One has eternal life, and one may just have temporal life. Fundamentally different. The other word in question in that statement with Peter is a karthatos. This is unclean by definition. This is the way a pig is unclean. Okay? So Peter said, I've never eaten anything ritually impure and nothing unclean. Why are those two statements relevant? Because as we learned from the Torah doesn't, only one case involving water can clean food become koinos, become defiled. According to the Torah, clean food is clean food, period. Okay? Some rabbis and some of the sages had decreed that clean food can become defiled, and one of the ways it was defiled was becoming into contact with unclean animals. Now, there were clean animals and unclean animals on Peter's sheet. So Peter says, I haven't eaten anything common or unclean. In other words, from Peter's perspective, he was saying, I can't eat any of this. Why? Because there was unclean animals next to these clean animals, and because of that, they are koinos, impure. I can't eat them, Lord. I can't eat any of this food. Don't you know I'm starving? You put this dang sheet in front of me, you're telling me to eat, and I can't eat a thing here. Right? That is the matter in question. And yes, Peter was a little dull for Mark 7. He didn't fully grasp the lesson he learned there, but not in the way people think. The lesson is this. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, what God had cleansed, that call not thou common, ritually impure. This was done thrice, and the vessel was received up again into heaven. Okay? First century belief. Unclean meat could ritually defile clean meat. Unclean animals could ritually defile clean animals. Disputes on Gentiles whether they were permanently defiled and whether contact with Jews caused defilement. The Torah does not say any of the above except the corner case with water and carcasses. Acts 10:17 through 20 says this. Now while Peter doubted in himself what this vision which he had seen could mean, behold, the men which were sent from Cornelius made inquiry for Simon's house and stood before the gate. Now Peter doubted in himself what this vision. He's like, I'm a little confused about this vision. What is it really saying here? And he called and he asked whether Simon, which was surnamed Peter, were lodged there. And while Peter thought of the vision, the Spirit said unto him, Behold, 3 men seek thee. So Peter still thinking on the vision, and the Spirit says, 3 men are seeking you. So it's starting to make the connections here. Arise, therefore, and get thee down, and go with them, doubting nothing, for I have sent them. So go with doubting nothing. Know that I've sent these guys. So Peter's still in a mindset here about what's acceptable practice, okay? That's the issue. Peter's in doubt of what's acceptable practice. And the Spirit's saying, go doubting nothing. So in other words, whatever happens, Peter, just trust that I sent them, go with it. In Acts 11:2-5, and when Peter was come up to Jerusalem, they were of the circumcision contended with him, saying, Thou wentest into men uncircumcised, and did eat with them. In other words, Peter, you just defiled yourself. You just became ritually impure. Why? Because you were the clean with the unclean. But Peter rehearsed the matter from the beginning, expounded to order unto them, saying, I was in the city of Joppa praying, in a trance I saw a vision, and certain vessels descended, and had been a great sheet let down from the heaven by 4 corners, and it came even to me. Right? So he related the vision. So we're going to step back a second. In other words, Peter relates the vision after it happened, and he starts talking about Cornelius, and we're going to deal with who is Cornelius. Acts 10:1-2 says, There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band. So Cornelius was a Gentile. No, he wasn't a Roman Catholic. He was a Roman soldier. He was a devout man and one that feared God with all of his house, which gave much alms to people and prayed to God always. He always prayed to God. He was a devout man. It's important, as many of you learned from here, that phrase devout man equals ger toshav. He was a convert in progress. Okay, he was not a full convert. How do we know that? Because Peter goes on to talk about him being denied water. In other words, some people were denying him full conversion status because he was a Roman. So he was experiencing some racial bias. So how was Cornelius cleaned? Okay, the Spirit fell upon him. How was he cleaned, though? He was cleaned. Ephesians 5:26 says that you might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of the water by the word. In other words, Cornelius was rendered clean because he purified himself by observing the word of God. He was a ger toshav. He wasn't just some random Gentile. Okay, it says he was a devout man. He prayed to God always. He gave alms to the people. He was a Torah observant to whatever degree he was allowed Gentile. So he wasn't really a full status Gentile. He wasn't a heathen. He wasn't a Gentile in that way. He was in progress. He was a ger toshav. He was a gate proselyte. So what did the vision mean? Acts 10:28 says this, And he said unto them, Ye know how that it was unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come into one of another nation. But God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. So what was the meaning of the vision? God showed me that I should eat any food. No. That I should not call any man common or unclean. Why? Is it unlawful according to the Torah for a Jew to have company with a man of another nation? No, it is not. So we're going to have a brief interruption here. As the nations around Judea made common cause with the Romans, the Zealots were naturally inflamed against every one of them, and therefore the Shemites, I mentioned him earlier, proposed to prevent all communication between Jew and Gentile by prohibiting the Jews from buying any article or food or drink from their heathen neighbors. The Hillelites, still moderate in their religious and political views, would not agree to such sharply defined exclusions, but when the Sanhedrin was called together to consider the propriety of such measures, the Shemites, with the aid of the Zealots, gained the day. Eleazar ben Ananias invited the disciples of both schools to meet at his house. Armed men were stationed at the door and instructed to permit everyone to enter, but no one to leave. During the discussions that were carried on or under these circumstances, many Hillelites are said to have been killed, and there and then the remainder adopted the restrictive propositions of the Shemites, known in the Talmud as the 18 Articles. On account of violence which attended those enactments, and because of the radicalism of the enactments themselves, the day on which the Shemites thus triumphed over the Hillelites was thereafter regarded as a day of misfortune. It comes from the Tosifta, Shabbat, and various other segments of the Talmud. This is from Jewish history. Remember, Hillel had probably died around the time Yeshua was about 10. From that point on, Shammai reigned. So around the time of the main segment of the Gospels, when Yeshua was close to 30, means Shammai had reigned for 20 years, 2 decades. And during this time, this thing happened here where they began to force separation between Jew and Gentile. So when Peter says it was not lawful, he is not referring towards the Torah. He's referring to laws enacted by the Sanhedrin, which are in sort of essence authorized by the Torah, but not necessarily always authorized by God. The Torah authorized elders, but it expects elders to use good and just judgment, and they were not at this time. In fact, it was counterintuitive, because if the Jews were to be a light to the nations, they basically just killed their mission when they enacted this. So when Peter says it was unlawful, he literally means it was unlawful. It was against Jewish law, not against the Torah, but it was against Jewish law for him to do this. So the heart of the matter is this. And then Peter opened his mouth and said, "Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in or with every nation or Gentile, he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him." That's the heart of the matter. And this is what the vision was about. Anyone that feareth God and worketh righteousness is acceptable to him. So who are they to get in the way of that? That was the rebuke. So what's the end result? Leviticus 11:45. "For I am Yahweh that brings you out of the land of Egypt to be your Elohim. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." Why are we to be holy? Because he is holy. You know, this Leviticus 11:45 comes at the end of the distinction between eating clean and unclean food. After relating what food is clean and what food is unclean, God says this: "For I am Yahweh that brings you out of the land of Egypt, be your Elohim. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." So what you eat is somehow related to being holy. Holy is Kodesh. You shall be Kadoshim, because he is Kadosh. The biblical term for holiness is Kodesh, Mishneh Hebrew Kedusha, and that which is regarded as holy is called Kadosh. Jewish exegesis following early rabbinic interpretation, such as the Sifra of Leviticus 19:2, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy," have consistently taken the verb Kadesh to mean distinguished, set apart. The Sifra paraphrases the commands with the words, "You shall be set apart." In Hebrew, the word can be for being, one of the ways you can say set apart would be Perushim. Do you know in Hebrew that's what Pharisee is? Perushim, set apart. The Jewish Virtual Library that says this: "The concept of holiness, because of its centrality in the Bible, affords an excellent illustration of how the biblical authors, under the dominance of the monotheistic idea, radically refashioned in whole or in part the notions of the sacred in the religions of the Near East. In primitive Semitic religions, as in primitive religions generally, the holy is considered an intrinsic, impersonal, neutral quality inherent in objects, persons, rites, and sites, a power charged with contagious efficacy, and therefore taboo. Seldom is the quality of holiness ascribed to the deity. In biblical religion, on the contrary, holiness expresses the very nature of God, and it is who he is. It's the ultimate source and is denominated the Holy One. And objects, persons, and site and activities that are employed in the service of in service of God derive their sacred character from that relationship. In other words, in much of pagan religions, things are holy. It's like a quality intrinsic to the object itself. From the biblical narrative, things are holy because of its relationship with God. God is the one that determines what is holy and what is not holy. Something is holy because it's set apart. God himself is holy in a way that even we don't reach. Why? Because he is the great and magnificent other. He is holy, holy. Holy, holy. He's holy with a W and holy with an H. He is completely, entirely holy. It is part of what he is. He's separate. He's limitless, unbound, completely detached from time and space, yet he's able to visit us within time and space. He is holy. He is set apart, but yet he's near. Holy is Kadosh. Holiness or Kadosh means at its core to be set apart. Prior to holiness, there's a process often translated in English as sanctification, which in Hebrew is Kadosh, or some say Kiddush. It means to separate. Obviously, then, to become Kadosh, set apart, one must be Kiddush, separated. To become holy, one must become sanctified. Contrary to popular Christian belief, yelling, "I am sanctified," really loudly does not actually sanctify you. But the act of separation can and does. When the Bible talks about sanctification, it's talking about the process of separation. When you separate, you're then set apart and therefore holy. Holy is not, you think in the pagan, Greco-pagan world, the notion of holiness deals with some sort of characteristic of goodness. In the Bible, holiness isn't entirely separate from goodness, but it's not necessarily about being good or bad. It's about being set apart. Now, being set apart may lead to goodness, may lead to righteousness. But someone isn't holy because they never sinned in their entire life. In fact, someone who sins can be holy. Why? Because they're set apart. They're set apart. Kadosh at its core, according to its three-letter root, kuf, dalet, shin, means to be fit or ready for use. To fit for use, you need to be, or to be fit for use, you need to be set apart by separation. He does. Oh man, I laugh at myself. It's from hanging around Chloe so much. We do this through commandments. If you've been sanctified by Jesus Christ truly, then you will have separated yourself through God's commandments because of him, not simply by thinking nice thoughts about him. In other words, if Yeshua has impacted your life, then you become obedient. Through the process of becoming obedient through commands, you're then going through sanctification. And after you've passed through sanctification by applying these commandments in your life, you then are holy. You're set apart. Why? Because these commandments set you apart. They set you apart from the material. They set you apart from the profane. They set you apart from the heathen. You're different. Holy is Kodesh. Hebrews 12:14 says, why? Why is it important? Why is holiness important? Hebrews 12:14 says this, follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see Eloah. Without holiness, you won't even see God. Why? Because until you're set apart, you miss it. It's the expression about seeing the forest through the trees, right? When you're immersed in the materialistic pagan thought process, pagan world, the heathen world, you cannot see God. When you set apart, when you become set apart and distinct, you're now outside of that. You can see clearly. You're stepped away and you can see things for what it is. You can perceive God. You can actually even perceive God in them, in that world that you've now distinguished yourself. The whole world even makes more sense. And I mean, it doesn't make sense on a level, but it also makes sense on a level. You can see why it is the way they are because of their lack of separation. You see that when you step into the light, you can perceive now the darkness that you've departed from. It becomes easier to understand that world in that sense. Why are they like that? Why do they do the things? Because they have no light. They're in the darkness. They're stumbling around. They cannot see. 1 Peter 1:15 says, "But as he which has called you is holy, so you be holy in all manner of behavior." As he called you, so you be holy. Now there are some that would say, well, I'm holy because Jesus made me holy. Well, Jesus only made you holy if you follow him. You have to be holy. Peter even says, you be holy. Someone can't go around and say, I'm holy. I prayed a prayer. I accepted Jesus as my Savior. I'm holy. You are not holy if you are not sanctified and set apart. By definition. Well, I'm a believer in Yeshua. Well, do you follow him? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, if you do not do the things which I say? Right? It's not merely enough to go around and proclaim things. You must do them. The essence of holiness, being set apart, doing them. And what you eat has everything to do with holiness. In Judaism, they say, there are some that say, if eating unclean food doesn't render you ritually impure, why not eat it? Because God says, that's the obvious answer, but there's an element that it makes you dull. The pagan world cannot perceive God because some of what they eat contains an element that makes them dull. The expression, you are what you eat. You eat the unclean, you become dull to the holy. When you begin to separate yourself from that, you begin to see things a little differently. Isn't that weird? There's a process, things become clear to you, you begin to understand, you begin to look at things different, you look at the world differently. Perhaps there's something to that. But this is one part, one element with holiness. And I'm not just saying holiness is simply about what you. It's far more than that. It's far more than that. But the Bible sums up in essence. Let's go there real quick before we end here with this. And that is, I got to go over here. Leviticus. Leviticus 10:10 says, "And that you may put difference between holy and unholy, between unclean and clean, that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which Yahweh has spoken unto them by the hand of Moses." So understanding between clean and unclean is pivotal. Listen, pivotal to being able to teach the children of Israel all the statutes. If you don't understand the difference between holy and unholy, between clean and unclean, you're going to have trouble teaching the children all the statutes which Yahweh has spoken to them by the hand of Moses. You're going to have a dullness to you. Right? Whoops. Yeah, back in 11:45. '43 says, "And you shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing," right? "Neither shall you make yourself unclean with them, that you should be defiled thereby. For I am Yahweh your Elohim. You shall therefore sanctify yourselves," right? Separate yourselves. Kedusha, sanctification. "And you shall be holy." So if you sanctify yourself, if you separate yourself from clean and unclean, you shall be Kadosh, set apart, holy. "For I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourself with any manner of creeping thing that creep upon the earth. For I am Yahweh that brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your Elohim. And you shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." That's why it's important. It's actually core, it's central. It's central to understanding all the scriptures is understanding clean and unclean, holy and unholy, profane and not profane. Why? Because if you don't understand the core concept of being set apart, you will think no issue of, but that's what everybody else does. That's the way the world does things. That's what the world says. This is the wisdom of the world. I mean, it kind of makes sense to me. Why should I do that? Why should I be different? Why should I do all these things? You know, we can attract more people to God if we just do what they do and insert some godliness into it, right? But you know what that does? That makes God profane. It makes God something common. He is not common. He is the source of holiness. He's the source of the other. He's the source of separateness. We don't make him do what we do. We do what he does. We are what he is. He is our creator. That's why we don't do it that way. But if you don't understand the core concepts of being set apart, it's not a big deal. Or if you do away with it, oh, everything's clean now. To the pure, all things are pure, right? Right? So what's it matter? Well, what happens is you mix the holy and profane. And you water down God. And you change him into something created into your own image. And guess what? He's not God anymore. He's your creation. You're not his creation. He's yours. And then what? You have control over the things that which you create, right? That's why people say things like, well, I believe in a God that would be like me, right? That's my favorite kind of God. I like God that'd be like me. He would hate what I hate and like what I like. And, you know, that's humanity's issue as its core. It's a whole other thing to struggle against ourselves and to say, this is profane. This is the opposite of holy. Changed. Right? So, with that, go ahead and close that. Like I said, we'll touch again about some of these elements of holiness from another angle, and probably even some addendums on clean and unclean. There's far more verses to go through, but I think that's a good overview.